Hey, Steve, this is Mark Mix from National Right to Work. Hey,
Mark.
sorry I missed you.
Yeah.
Apologize about that.
No worries. It happens. Appreciate you calling back, though. And I'm looking forward to talking to you about this as we're coming into Labor Day weekend. There are obviously a lot of Labor Day celebrations that we see every year. And this year, I guess the labor unions have a lot to celebrate, don't they? They've got some really good friends now in high positions.
They absolutely do, Steve. And President Biden just released a resolution, honoring folks that work on Labor Day and saying that everything that is sustainable in this country was created by labor unions. And I think 94% of the private sector workers in the country that are not part of the union, even though maybe some of them would like to be, would have some argument with that.
Yeah.
But, this president's about empowering union officials, not rank and file workers. And all of the policies that he's implemented in his last 8 months have been designed to do just that.
Well, he's got to pay back his supporters. I mean, if they're going to throw millions upon millions of dollars into his elections and into his campaign, well, then there's a they want something in return for that, obviously.
Yeah, actually, it's amazing when you think about the money that they poured in. It's not even really millions and millions. And I know even now, billions doesn't seem like much, Steve, with all of the money that's being thrown around in Washington. We're into the trillions now. And what comes next, by the way? Is it quadrillion? I think it's quadrillion. I think we better prepare for that, so we should know that.
We're going to
especially
get there
well-informed radio hosts like you. Well-informed radio hosts, you should know that. But, we put out a study that showed that union officials across the country spent in the last 2 years, just in the last 2-year election cycle, up to $1.8 billion on politics and lobbying. So, yeah, they've got a big debt to repay, but they did get a decent payoff with Joe Biden in the White House and Chuck Schumer running the Senate and Nancy Pelosi in the House of Representatives.
What's amazing to me, and I was thinking about this morning when they were talking about the abortion bill in Texas and the reaction to it by Nancy Pelosi, and I don't want to get into the details of it, but this idea that once these people are elected to office in Washington, D.C., that they can make rules for the rest of the country. This whole idea of federalism seems to be lost on these people. They think they have the unique power to tell 330 million people how to live their lives simply because they got elected to office in their one little district.
Yeah, and that's right. And, there was a conversation about that back in, 1787, 1788, about what role the federal government was going to play in the lives of Americans. And obviously they have not only expanded the bubble of federal control, but they have blown out the bubble of federal control and control basically everything. And labor policy is a great example, Steve. I mean, we have a federal labor policy that imposes forced unionisms on the states. Connecticut and the 22 other states that don't have right to work laws don't have a statute that say a worker loses their job if they don't pay union dues or fees. That authorization for union officials to have you fired comes from, guess what, federal law that was imposed. And frankly, Roosevelt, when this law was passed in the 1930s, he knew, because when they first introduced the National Industrial Recovery Act, the Supreme Court said, no, the federal government can't do that. You can't impose this on the states. Well, Roosevelt wasn't one to give up, and, you never let a good crisis go to waste. We've heard that before in numerous situations. Well, he just re-teed the bill up. He threatened the Supreme Court by threatening to pack it to 15 members, and 2 of the justices, the Chief Justice and an Associate Judge, switched their votes, and now we have a federal labor policy that's imposed on the entire country. And interestingly enough, from our perspective on this Labor Day, as we look back and think about right-to-work laws, that was a privilege granted by the federal government. Get this. This is like, an edict comes out from the kingdom out to outside the fence or outside the moat and says, oh, by the way, we're going to grant you the ability to say that workers can't be fired if they choose not to support financially a labor union. So you're right. The federal Leviathan is alive and big and growing, and Lord knows we're going to have to get ready for quadrillion, Steve.
Without a doubt. I didn't properly introduce my guest here. This is Mark Mix. He's the president of the National Right to Work Committee, and he also serves as the president of the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation. So the man knows of what he is speaking. And one of the things that's happening right now is this PRO-Act legislation that's being pushed. It actually passed the House and is pending in the U.S. Senate. That is just amazing in its scope and in what it does, wiping out the 27 right-to-work laws just at the federal level that these states have, which I think, again, as you just talked about, is a complete overreach of federal powers over the states. But so many other little things in here that just wouldn't seem to be problematic, except they truly are. And one of them that jumped out at me was this idea that they want to force unionization of freelance workers like Uber drivers. I mean,
yeah, Steve, this is interesting. Yeah, you got it. I mean, that the so-called AB5 language that basically bloomed out in California because Uber drivers and Lyft drivers and other gig economy workers, which is a growing part of our economy, no question about that, where workers basically say, here's what I'm doing. If you'd like to buy some of it, you can do that, but I'm not going to be an employee because I do other things. And, those employees, and you won't be surprised by this, Steve, hold on, independent contractors can't be unionized. You can only unionize employees. And so we've got to make them employees so that the unions can get a crack at forcing them to pay dues to increase the union coffers. And that's in the bill. And so you're right to be alarmed about these types of federal encroachments on, when you decide you want to turn on your meter in your car or your computer or your phone in the car and then turn it off when you want to and work on Monday and Wednesday and Friday as opposed to Monday through Friday or you want to work at 11 o'clock at night as opposed to 8 o'clock in the morning, they're going to take away that and make you an employee based on some kind of control over an algorithm, if you will.
And we've seen this big push in places like California to make these people employees as opposed to independent contractors. And it never occurred to me that this was the next step in that process. So if the first step is to have them considered employees, which means now that Uber has to provide health insurance and all these other things, now it's becoming really clear what the push was for, especially in places like California, and that's to give the unions more membership, meaning more power.
That's right. And actually, there's already legislation on the books in Sacramento that would do just that. In fact, we ended up representing dozens of Uber drivers up in Seattle when the Seattle City Council passed an ordinance that said in order to be an Uber driver or a Lyft driver, you had to be a Teamster union member, and you had to let the Teamsters represent you. We actually represented those employees up there. The case actually, interestingly enough and surprisingly, died in the Ninth Circuit on an antitrust argument, but it was pretty clear back then, this was a couple of years back, that this was the game and this was the vision. And frankly, Steve, as you know, these regressive leftists, they have long views and long set goals, and most of the time, regular Americans are just trying to do their job, take care of their family, and they don't want to play politics. They have to when they want to, or when they have to, they do, but they kind of go back to their own lives. But these regressive leftists are about changing our country, and they're always engaged, and there's a long vision for all of this. And it's pretty clear when you see bills that would, for example, take away your right to vote for unionization by secret ballot and force you to just sign a card when 3 union officials show up on your porch at 10 o'clock at night and say, hey, sign the card. Union officials even admit that people sign those cards just to get the union officials off their front porch or off their back. And yet that's going to be the way that workers are going to be forced into these forced associations that, unions basically want to spread across the entire country. And it's not about the American worker. American workers have a free choice to decide whether or not they want to support a union. In fact, any worker right now could join the AFL-CIO and pay them money and give them their paycheck and do all of that if they wanted to. The question is, will you be forced? And this PRO Act is about forcing workers into unions and empowering union officials and giving them more power over America's workers.
Which, just flies in the face of the basis for this country. We were not meant to have a country run this way where you're giving these unelected officials, especially the power to force people to do things against their will. But again, they believe, I think, that this is the way the country should run, and they have a very friendly administration and leaders in both houses of Congress that they're going to take advantage of that while they can. One of the other problems I have, one of the things that I find rather humorous about these gig workers getting hosed here is many of these gig workers are people who write columns or independently write for different newspapers and magazines and other publications. And a lot of those people were promoting and supporting this effort to have them be considered employees until it actually happened. And then they found out, if the publishers said, okay, if anything more than whatever 6 or 8, whatever the number was, I don't know what it was, columns, you are considered an employee. And so they stopped hiring or buying these columns from these people after that number. And these people are now going, wait a second, this is my living. I can't sell. Yeah, guess what? Unintended consequences, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. And interesting enough, Steve, to complete the story on that, all of those people that were put out of work decided that they were going to try to put amendments to the so-called AB5 bill on the ballot. And they did that in November of 2020. And the people of California, get this, the people of California actually overturned many of the provisions of AB5. But just 2 weeks ago, the California State Supreme Court overruled the result of the referendum for some really obscure reason, saying that the opinion of the public is not necessary here. We're going to decide to follow through on your threat of these elitists sitting up here and saying, sit down, shut up. This is what's good for you. They overturned the amendments. Well, the PRO Act didn't even bother with the amendments. They have the original AB5 language in it. But to your point, it was interesting that those that were crying out the loudest about having this thing implemented were the ones that were crying out the loudest when they couldn't make money anymore for the work that they wanted to do.
Yeah, well, it's like the very people who, well, again, I don't want to get into the politics of it, but when they implemented the Affordable Care Act, they changed the definition of a full-time worker, and lo and behold, a lot of companies cut people's hours, and people were really angry about that, and they were getting angry at the business owner, and it was like, no, don't get angry at the business owner, folks. Get angry at the rules that they put in place, because people are going to figure out ways to work within the rules, and generally, you're going to get hurt. So I just find it always kind of ironic when the very people who promote these sort of things end up getting hurt by them without even realizing why and where that came from. There's a couple of other issues that are happening here, too, and it's the National Labor Relations Board. That's another thing that I don't even know why that exists, but under different administrations, it tends to move back and forth regarding some of their rulings. And now under a very friendly Biden administration, we're seeing it being taken over by some very, very, very pro-labor union people, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Steve. And it's actually not even really pro-labor. It's pro-forced unionism. That's the key. Because, the idea of unionism is something, if it's voluntary, then, we shouldn't have a problem with that. In fact, today President Biden honors some of the old labor leaders of the country, and he mentions Samuel Gomper's name. Samuel Gompers is kind of the grandfather of American unionism. And Samuel Gompers, in his final speech in El Paso, Texas, to the AFL delegates in 1924, said this. He said, "I want to urge devotion to the fundamentals of human liberty, the principles of voluntarism. No lasting gain has ever come from compulsion. If we seek to force, we but tear apart that which, united, is invincible." So basically, Gompers was telling people, don't force workers to join us. Go out and sell your product to them, and they will be inherently stronger. But yet the American labor movement today and the leaders, the big bosses of the union movements, are all about federal legislation to impose more forced unionism on Americans. And you're so right. I mean, these people the NLRB is the implementer of that. This National Labor Relations Board is a 5-member board that adjudicates the federal labor policy that's been cast over the entire country back in the 1930s. It was 3, now it's 5, and you're right. Biden had to fire the top lawyer at that agency 23 minutes into his administration because that top lawyer during the Trump years was actually doing something that was really nefarious. He was unbelievably considering employee rights when it's supposed to be a battle between big business and big labor. And God forbid we can't have anyone thinking about the employee in place so important. Yeah.
No, we have union bosses to enrich. One of the things that I find really kind of just disheartening too is nobody's calling the president out for some of these things. Your organization is, and talking about how he basically just violated his own ethics pledge by putting former union officials on the NLRB. I mean, in what world does nobody call this guy out for this kind of stuff?
Yeah, see, what is that cliche that we're using way too often now? Rules for thee, but not for me.
Yeah, exactly.
Is that an appropriate answer to your question? Yeah. Look, this guy has got one, and I'm not even sure he really knows what's going on at that level, but he knows he's got people around him that understand that this is a time to take power, and this is a time to expand power. And he doesn't care how he does it, whether he breaks the ethics rules. I mean, you have a general counsel of the National Labor Relations Board who came from being the general counsel of the Communication Workers of America, one of the more radical unions in the country. And when asked about whether or not she was going to recuse herself about about any cases that might be dealing with their previous employer, the Communication Workers America. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I don't think so. I think this is fine. And then there's two new board members on the 5-member board that is now controlled by by Biden appointees that were basically general counsel, one a general counsel and one an acting general counsel for the SEIU, which is one of the most radical unions in the country. And they're going to be sitting there adjudicating cases on behalf of union officials that will go against not only businesses, but will go against employees. And we know that a big bulk of our cases at the Right to Work Foundation are at the National Labor Relations Board. We're probably one of the largest litigators there on behalf of individual employees against unions and against big business. And boy, oh boy, the environment has changed because Biden doesn't care much about his rules. They don't apply to him or his people.
Final thought, Mark. I want to talk to you just briefly about this Janus ruling and how the unions are doing everything they can to sort of bypass it, or in the cases of like here in Connecticut, just ignore it entirely, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Janus was a case we won at the U.S. Supreme Court back in 2018 that basically said that every government employee in America had a First Amendment right. They couldn't be compelled to pay dues to a government union in order to keep their jobs, because everything government unions do is, guess what, politics and lobbying. So you can't be forced to speak. Well, what they've done, and we have actually 2 cases pending at the U.S. Supreme Court now, one in New Jersey where teachers have objected to what is a 10-day window period, that if you miss it, Steve, by 30 seconds on either side, and if you don't do it just right by showing up at the union hall, providing your driver's license or social security number, and you miss it, you're locked in for another year. And that's happened in a couple of states. We've got 2 teachers from Chicago that we're representing that we're heading to the U.S. Supreme Court with, and we hope the court will hear it, because basically what the unions are doing, to your point, are flouting the decision of the United States Supreme Court back in 2018 that says, look, not only do you have a First Amendment right, but you have to tell someone, you have to affirmatively say that you're willing to support the union. That hasn't happened in many states across the country, and we're going to continue to fight to fix that.
Well, that's why I appreciate having you on, and that's why I appreciate the efforts of your organization, because the fact that they can just ignore Supreme Court rulings shows you just how much power the unions have here in this country. And it takes an organization like yours to push back, and hopefully the Supreme Court will see it your way, and we'll be able to get these rules enforced. And unfortunately, it looks like you're in for a bit of a couple of tough years here, though, under this administration.
Indeed. We've been through these before. I've been doing this for 35 years, and there's good years and there's bad years. You know, the Bible tells us to harvest when it's good and to store up when it's not, and that's what we'll do. So, Steve, thanks for the opportunity. I'm sorry I was late today. I apologize about that. Thanks for reaching out to us on this to talk about this important issue.
Yeah, no, and thank you very much for calling in, and I appreciate the conversation, and thanks for your efforts. Mr. Mark Mix, where can people learn more about the National Right to Work Committee?
They can find us at the on that amazing internet at nrtw.org.
Fantastic, Mark. Keep up the good work, and we'll look forward to having you back.
Thanks, Steve.
Take care.